Subscribe or you'll be visited by the toll troll. Is there any way a musician can make money these days? Not a rapper. Not a singer. Not doing live shows. Is it possible for someone who writes music and records/produces their own songs to become successful, or is it impossible? I'm interested to see what Biz thinks. Guitar. Bass. Percussion. Keys. No, you've been replaced by AI slop. Howdy. Right now every average Seth and his grandmother are making indie games. If that shite is up your alley, I'm sure you can get some contracting in. Solid idea, thank you Anon. Would you happen to know where I can submit songs or look for people who need work done for their games? As a musician it's expected that I have low IQ, so I'll take any help I can get. First of all, don't put yourself down, Keck. Talk to Anons on the fitting generals on the video game board. Go to Reddit Game Dev Classifieds, Game Dev Jobs, Enit. Put your stuff on YouTube like the Composer's Disaster Piece or Megan McDuffie. Dumpster dive Twitch for streamers who are streaming their development process. Also try to contact bigger indie studio names like Relogic or Rundisk and similar ones. Not doing live shows literally the only foreseeable career in music. Musician here. Even before AL, shite was rough, but you could at least make a living by producing 1,000 hours of random shite for stock music libraries. That's over now. AL music is here and will soon bankrupt that market. You need to be someone that people would rather spend the extra money to hire, instead of an AL. That means you need to spend time developing a unique and high quality style. If you're a guy that makes generic rock/orchestra/electronic/etc., AL has already replaced you. Or, you could embrace the change and become an AL music producer. I guess you should isolate a demand for what you are supplying. You have to accept that music is so saturated that no one will notice another dude making it in his bedroom, and this has nothing to do with the quality of your work. It's also fact that the audience doesn't have time to hunt you down. They're busy digesting what publishers are ramming down their throats. The audience isn't interested in music as an art or a science, they just want to dance, laugh, or fit in. The industry, on the other hand, wants money for nothing. Moving forward, music will become increasingly procedurally generated, finally leaving the rent-seeking IP industry without the nuisance of having to invest effort into their work, or negotiate with artists, who are notoriously hard to work with. The record industry has centralized and consumed the last century of music, and like Hollywood, they have no incentive or interest in taking risks. Culture is not economically viable. It's very possible that the next generation will view playing an instrument as an antiquated novelty, and you're likely to see DJ's role expanding into real-time sequencing of music using procedural AL algorithms, effectively making the laptop a one-man band. This effect will probably be delayed in the more idealistic styles, such as metal, rap, classical, and jazz, who all take their art and culture seriously. Elitists are the ones you want to win over. Those crowds are full of people who make the art part of their identity and are passionate enough to spend money on it, and want to see it live. There is always a demand for high-quality rhythm sections, by the way. I highly recommend learning to use your voice. It's the only instrument no one else on the planet can play, and singing is the most organic way to create music. I ended up treating my music career as a vanity project. There is no money in what I learned to create. I'll probably end up in an 80s cover band desu. If I knew how to write software, I would consider creating a DAW that housed an algorithm for generating music. Probably a series of them, each based on a specific style, so the validators could tailor very specific products for very specific markets. By paying a fee of a native token, the engine would provide a piece of music, probably in MIDI format, along with an NFT that verifies it as yours. Of course, the nature of procedural music generators is that it won't take long until every useful combination of data is claimed. It may already be the case that every song really worth listening to already belongs to someone else. Kind of like how every piece of land worth living on is already claimed. No, it's a hobby at best to satisfy your creative needs, if you actually have any. When you learn to communicate, you'll find that no one needs to pay you. And when you learn to communicate in song, you'll find that you feel pretty cool. If I also knew how to write software, I'd make a MIDI guitar version of the real-time sequencing you mention. Have a rhythm section follow along in key to what you're playing. Maybe have a general structure to the song that gradually builds upon itself with each successive time played. Want to be a Smith/Ecstasy/Prefab Sprout cover band? Finally leaving the rent-seeking IP industry. Hey, some actual good news from all this. You misunderstand. Perhaps I misspoke. I'm very high. I mean to say that the record industry will own all the IP worth having, collect royalties forever and forbid unauthorized use, powered by Chainlink, remove the necessity for artists to create more, and drown competition under weight of the publishing industry. Music will still be made independently, but it will not be heard at large. The music industry, more like the music institution at this point, will decide what people hear, and it will either be written by a computer or sold for pennies by the creator. This isn't good news, outside of the fact that human music will possibly become a grassroots movement. Yeah, neat. I've heard of MIDI fretboard controllers, but I've never seen one more sophisticated than a Guitar Hero controller. You could manufacture it with as many buttons as necessary, but I wouldn't imagine you'd need much more complicated than 5 to 12, for pentatonic intervals at the least to chromatic intervals at most. Especially if it was assisted and communicated with the right piece of software. If the key is already mapped, then all the harmonic information for the triggers already exists. The button just provides a modal command for an algorithmic arpeggio, or maybe a procedurally generated melody/harmony, or instructed to counterpose the previous melody, and it could bank sections on board to be combined, isolated, looped, or whatever. It'd be programmed to alternate in accord with a chart that factors in changes to tempo, time, key, and arrangement. No more complicated than a timeline function you'd see in ADAW. Drums would be the easiest part. You probably wouldn't need an algorithm to generate them. A database of common beats could easily be the foundation on a project and work 90% of the time, perhaps with the option of adding randomized algorithmic quantization to add some variety to the syncopation if necessary. All these factors would create a web of interconnected variables where what happens next is determined by what has already occurred. My only issue with this approach is that I imagine the nature of real-time procedural music is the operator is responsible for programming what comes next while the previous work plays out, in the same way the DJ spends the current song preparing transitions and playlists. I'm not sure exactly how flexible the approach would be if the operator is also actually playing faux guitar. Though I guess it wouldn't be terribly more demanding than operating a turntable, and much of the arrangement and composition could be prefabricated, loop-based, trigger-operated, or otherwise intuitive in some way. I've heard of MIDI fretboard controllers, but I've never seen one more sophisticated than a Guitar Hero controller. You could manufacture it with as many buttons as necessary, but I wouldn't imagine you'd need much more complicated than 5 to 12. A keyboard does the job. That's not even beginning to contemplate mixed choices, instrumentation/plug-in automation, procedural synthesis, dynamic functions, sampling options. The machine simply needs a few variables defined here and there, and it can produce entire symphonies in real time, determined by what triggers the operator is using, cross-reference to the chart. I have mixed feelings about the implications of the invention of procedural music and how I suspect it will be used to crush creativity, but there is no denying that once the technology is fully realized, it will be the most groundbreaking development in audio technology and musical engineering since the invention of the synthesizer, or valves in brass instruments. You're not wrong. What is being described is, more or less, a keyboard, I guess. I am indeed too high to address the basics, and I think I'm just enjoying pretending to be smart. Since synthesis, Therese simply nothing a keyboard cannot do, and Therese no reason to overcomplicate it. The C word who made Balatros music was from Fiverr. But yes, trying to make music for money is for losers. Biz and music only intersect on tech, products, peripherals, marketing, etc. You want to get rich in music, make a jogger think they can sing? Antares, Autotune, did it at epic scale. I like the way you think. I just figured you're high, and it would be funny to mention a keyboard does the job keck. Who knows, maybe a blueprint for a piece of plastic that a Chinese workshop can mass produce is a good business idea within the music industry, like a cross between a Guitar Hero controller and a keyboard, that isn't a keytar but something entirely new. Unfathomably based. Maybe some device that can trick people into thinking they are talented that controls their voice and acts as an instrument that isn't a vocoder or voice box. Only Biz could think out loud to make these things happen, and I hope someone in this thread makes it one day. Since synthesis, Therese simply nothing a keyboard cannot do, and Therese no reason to overcomplicate it. LOL, no way. There is a whole MPE/peripheral industry trying to innovate on this. 0 to 127 MIDI keyboards are definitely not expressive enough to compete with analog instruments. I.e., L'Instrument, Array 2. A 5-second professional sounding guitar part has so many articulations that you would need like 20 extra button presses just to cover the basics in MIDI, like palm muting, staccato, a guitar's chromatic slides, bends, etc., not to mention the countless micro variations introduced by the player/instrument. No, there's plenty of room for improvement. A keyboard will still have its uses, but there are going to be serious alternatives. For example, I have VSTs where notes 0 to 30 are used for articulations, and all this achieves is make MIDI slop sound like a fake bass guitar. No way in hell can you apply those articulations live, because you have to be a master at using 30 buttons, instead of just sliding from F# to A, or popping/slapping a B into a pull-off. The more time you spend in post, the better they can sound, but who the hell wants to sit there editing MIDI roll for ages? That's exactly the shite that makes modern music suck. They just sit there, clicking a pathetic bass line, a jogger and his root notes, into a MIDI roll. Then they click in some 808 jogger drum MIDI and just loop it. The controller itself or the orientation of the keys isn't really what is important about this technology, desu. My original conception of procedural music was really just a set of variables and fields defined at the beginning of the process, which the computer uses to construct a pattern. For example, I want 64 bars of 4/4 at 100 BPM in the key of A, with 3 unique chord structures, and a rock band instrumentation. The drum chart would probably form something of a reference point, you might consider it a rhythm key or something, which acts as a guide for the other sections to lock into by some metric, and probably to varying degrees based on instrument role. Bass might adhere specifically to the kick drum when determining the phrasing of a bar, for example. The program renders one of the innumerable possible outcomes, quantizes it as best it can to synchronize properly, resolves all bar lengths, and presents it in a form that can be further manipulated if so desired. There would be ways to refine the process further so it becomes more palatable and flexible. I'm a bit too regarded to work that out yet because I don't know anything about programming, but am convinced there are enough mathematical features to music that a computer could manage the task of putting it together. Device that can trick people into thinking they are talented, that controls their voice and acts as an instrument that isn't a vocoder or voice box. Yes. I actually think that will be a huge thing and I'm waiting for it. Being able to use voice as live input will be amazing. I don't into electronic music, but I watch a guy called Beardy Man who has an insane setup and is very capable with his voice. He would be able to make miracles happen with it. There's some voice to MIDI stuff, but it's crap. We are just waiting for the autotune of voice to MIDI, voice toomp. Then the next hurdle is to just put on a cap and use brain waves. There's also no reason why we shouldn't be able to use our eyes to control DAW/VST. I'm giga bullish on AI plus music. There's not gonna be money in it for the end user, but it will be fun and liberating. Actually, if you can come up with a great peripheral, you can make a lot of money. Look at this shite, it's all trash. Drum pads? Why do they all still have these crappy pads? Factory-made jogger crap with wild variation. It takes X Newton to trigger one pad, but Y Newton to trigger the other pad on the same instrument. Why are we still finger drumming on 1980s tech with BS tactile sensors and a crappy processor? You can't even do 16th notes at 180 BPM reliably on those pieces of shite. Forget about a velocity curve that makes sense. You'll have to max trigger all the notes at 127 vel. Most of the shite we use is so obsolete and crappy that it heckin' hurts. Analog is fundamentally superior medium to track a wave with, and it will probably require a quantum computing approach to close that gap with digital. I understand the exact issues you're talking about. Programming MIDI is a huge pain in the ass for a second-rate result. I don't bother unless it is necessary. However, I will point you to the issue that the average music consumer does not give a shite about this, and digital media wins by virtue of accessibility if nothing else. MIDI has a lower barrier of entry than mastering an instrument, and there's very few people with easy access to the 127 MIDI options. Can you access a harpsichord and a pianist? How about the equipment and space to record it properly? At any rate, the consumer didn't realize that dynamic rang was taken away from him. The consumer will pick MP3 format over WAV because it's smaller, and even if he had listened to music in something other than an earbud in the last 10 years, he would not notice the difference. The issues you are describing are not relevant to anyone but audiophiles, producers, and engineers. It matters to you and me, but not to the market, apparently. I released a record in a record label from one of the most known electronic musicians in the world, but then never bothered to pursue this further. The only way to make money is to constantly doing live gigs, and I doubt it would have been viable. You also need to make music to stay relevant, I guess, and I cannot make music for money. I haven't made anything in years, it's not enjoyable. Perhaps when I'm rich I will get on it again. I have no time now. The average music consumer does not give a shite about this. It matters to you and me, but not to the market, apparently. Heck yeah, that's probably the biggest obstacle. If the majority of the market accepts 4-chord songs that never change, with obviously auto-tuned vocals where they can't even tell it's auto-tuned, what's the point of anything really, in terms of monetization or risk/reward? The music institutions have already won in this regard. The big four labels run the entire Western music industry like a mafia, and they have more in common in terms of business structure with a real estate trust, or a bank, than a creative agency. Their sole interest is in buying up cash cow IPs and renting it for royalty checks. Every time public domain rears its head, they lobby for an extension of copyright laws. They aren't investing in talent because they don't need it. People will consume whatever they are given by promoters. They're too flooded with options to think twice about it. I'm guilty of it. This practice, an artist has about 10 seconds to get my attention with a song. I don't have enough time in my day to allow them any more than that. There are so many more factors at play than musical quality in that decision. So the labels approach music the same way studios approach movies. Does it make more sense to invest in the risk of a new story, when the option of rehashing a classic is there, and just recast the lead as a nigger or a girl boss? Half the work is already done, and the other half doesn't require any effort, because when it bombs, you can just pay journalists to blame that on racism or something, accuse the original fanbase of being out of touch, and let regard Goislop enjoyers argue over it as cheap promotions. This has been Hollywood's playbook for heckin' years now. It's so heckin' obvious that there is no interest in actually trying in big media anymore. It's less risky and less effort to destroy things people love, and blame them for not liking it. Art as a passion is a hobby, and arguably, it's better that way desu. The media institutions have made it clear that your standards are a nuisance for them and quality control is more or less merely overcomplicating the product. In this thread, Biz starts a band. It becomes so technical and niche that it's made on tactile instruments in large spaces with expensive equipment, put onto tape and then digitally restored just to be slightly lower quality than what Jogger Jamal and his crew can whip up in 10 minutes with a cheap keyboard and a DAW.